We're now continuing the period of kings by looking at King Solomon, who is the son of David. We concluded our last section by looking at the final years of David and how he gave everything he had to the Lord, and he also gave warnings to his son and exhorted him to serve the Lord. The story now is picked up with Solomon in both the King's account and in Chronicles. What I'd like you to do is take the timeline out, and I'd like you to notice the bullet points that we have for Solomon, and I want you to see where we are headed, because Solomon is going to build the temple. He's very well known for this, and he's going to be offering a great prayer of dedication in 2 Chronicles chapter 6, and God's going to respond. It's beautiful. And yet God also gives Solomon warnings about the importance of following his laws. And Solomon, at the end of his life, tragically marries foreign women and starts worshipping their gods. And God is going to bring judgment against Solomon. And that's why you'll see on the timeline, it is with Solomon that the kingdom then divides, because God announces that he's going to bring judgment against his son. And so the judgment is going to come during Rehoboam, and that then is going to lead to the division of the kingdom. So look at the bullet points that we have for Solomon. First of all, notice that Solomon, the arrow continues from David to Solomon. That is showing dynastic succession. We have the picture of a temple with the glory cloud. This is really what he's known for. He is the temple building king, and God chose him for this. It says, builds the temple in Jerusalem. God's glory fills the temple. He's a wise king because he asked God for wisdom at the beginning, but many wives and idols. And then we have the last bullet point, the kingdom torn away from his son Rehoboam. You see the arrow that points after Solomon? There's an arrow. That arrow is really trying to indicate dynastic succession, and that then traces that blue line on the lower part of the timeline. But we're also going to have a northern kingdom with Jeroboam as our first king. And that then leads to a time of the divided kingdom where we have a northern kings and we have southern kings. It gets a little bit complicated at times, but having the timeline in front of you will help. I'd also like you to take out your map to look at the map for the United Kingdom. This will be the last time we're looking at this map because we're about to move to the divided kingdom. Notice that Saul's kingdom was fairly small, and then David expanded the kingdom. There were military victories, and the kingdom expands even further under Solomon. And this really is a time of the flourishing of the kingdom. There's a lot of wealth that comes into Jerusalem. We have tribute from the nations coming in. Solomon is going to secure Phoenicians to work on the temple, and it's a massive building project. So look at this and notice the flourishing of the kingdom during the time of Solomon. Right, we're now going to look at the biblical material, and the story of Solomon is taken up in 1 Kings 1 to 11 and in 2 Chronicles 1 to 9. The King's material, 1st and 2nd Kings, describes both the northern and the southern kingdom. Chronicles does as well, but its emphasis is on the southern kingdom. So when we come to the prayer of Solomon, I'm going to be looking at that in Chronicles because there is more material about Solomon there. But when we come to the division of the kingdom, I'm going to jump back to Kings because that's not in Chronicles. So first of all, if you could turn to the opening chapters of Kings and notice that in chapter 1, Solomon is anointed as king, and David gives him a charge about warnings of following the Lord, the importance of it. And I'm going to read from chapter 2, verses 3 and 4. He says to Solomon, "Keep the charge of the Lord your God to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his ordinances, his testimonies, according to what is written in the law of Moses, that you may succeed in all that you do." And look at the next verse. "So that the Lord may carry out his promise, which he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons are careful of their way to walk before me in truth with all their heart and with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne. God had given the promise to David, and now we find out here that it is the son who is going to be the recipient of the promise is required to obey God's laws. And this makes a lot of sense, because God had already told David that the kingdom would be an everlasting kingdom, and that the Davidic king, his son, would rule over the kingdom of the Lord. And you need to have a righteous king following God's laws, ruling over the kingdom of the Lord. Therefore, the obedience of Solomon is going to be necessary in order for him to be the recipient of the blessings. In these chapters, in the opening chapters 1 to 3, there are several deaths that take place as the kingdom is being consolidated and those disloyal to David are being killed. And then in chapter 3, we have this prayer of Solomon. And the prayer of Solomon, God's going to give him a warning in this prayer as well. But the prayer of Solomon is also taken up in 2 Chronicles chapter 1, and that's where I'm turning. We're looking now at the narrative in 2 Chronicles chapter 1. Remember that we finished with David in 1 Chronicles chapter 29. So 2 Chronicles, it begins with Solomon as king. God exalts him. He's under God's blessing. He prays to God. He seeks the Lord, and God appears to him. And Solomon asks God for wisdom, and God promises to give him wisdom, and he promises he's going to bless him with a lot of resources as well. Then in chapter 2, Solomon plans to build the temple. And he's going to build his own palace, and he secures Phoenicians. These are the artisans and the maritime traders, the traders that are able to use ships to transport items. And so he secures the Phoenicians, and he enters into an alliance with the king of Tyre, and he's going to secure gold and artisans to work on the temple. 2 Chronicles chapter 3 verse 1. In this verse, we are given the location of the temple, which is Mount Moriah. Well, Mount Moriah recalls two key stories in the Old Testament, one to do with Abraham and one to do with David. The story of Abraham is in Genesis 22, when Abraham offered up his son, and God then provided a substitute as the burnt offering. That was in the region of Moriah. And then the other story, 1 Chronicles chapter 21, is when David bought the threshing floor from the Jebusite, and that also is Mount Moriah. Therefore, the location of the temple has these two major stories, Israel's traditions in view. Genesis 22 to do with Abraham, and then David, underscoring for us that the location of the temple was not a random thing, that God had a plan and a purpose, and that is being highlighted in chapter 3 verse 1. And then in verse 2 we are told that Solomon began to build the temple in the 4th year of his reign, and this dates it to 966 BC. Chapters 3 and 4 describe the furniture that it's being used. It is very similar to the language being used in the tabernacle narrative way back in Exodus 25 to 40 that describe the furniture, except everything is bigger because it's a larger building. But we have the Holy of Holies. We have the description of this most holy place, and with the cherubim and with gold being used. And there are also echoes of the Garden of Eden, which we said was sacred space. We said some of the language is going to be picked up in the tabernacle and in the temple, and that's exactly what you find here, because Solomon is making a place worthy of the presence of God. The temple is not about the structure. The temple is about who lives and resides there. And it is a climactic moment in 2 Chronicles chapter 5 when the Ark of the Covenant, remember you've looked at that already in the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, when God's glory comes down. This is the place of his footstool, if you like. God is enthroned in heaven above, and the temple is a microcosm of his heavenly throne. The temple points us somewhere else. It reminds us that there is something bigger and beyond it, which the book of Revelation 21 and 22, where John has this unveiling of God's heavenly throne, there are hints of that already here in the temple that is being built. And the end of Chronicles, 2 Chronicles chapter 5, verses 11 to 14, you have the Levitical worship leaders with their cymbals and their harps and their lyres, and we have this wonderful picture of worship and praise to God and great joy, because the presence of God among his people brings great joy to his people. The glory cloud comes down and fills the house. Verse 14. But the story of the temple does not end with the glory coming down. This is what we saw with the tabernacle and with the glory coming down. But here, the narrative doesn't end there, because the temple is pointing ultimately to the communion of God with his people. And so chapter 6, and it's a long chapter when you read it, a beautiful, beautiful chapter. 42 verses. This records Solomon's prayer to God. And he builds this large altar, and he kneels down and he's got his hands lifted up before God. And we have a window into this beautiful prayer where he acknowledges God's faithfulness and he acknowledges God's character and his covenant faithfulness. And he marvels at the fact that God, who dwells in heaven, is going to be present here. And he marvels at that. He also describes a series of events that could come upon God's people if they sin. And he says, well, there's no one who doesn't sin. And these are kind of rehearsing a lot of the curses of the Mosaic covenant that we've already seen. And with each one of them, the response of God's people, they are to pray, they are to seek God's face, they are to turn from their evil ways. And Solomon says to God, would you please hear and forgive your people? This prayer reverberates throughout the stories of kingship that follow, especially in the southern kingdom. Well, the temple building narrative doesn't even finish with Solomon's prayer to God, because the temple building narrative is not about monologue. Prayer with God is not monologue. That's what you do with an idol. In the ancient world, you tell the idol what to do, but the idol has eyes that it cannot see, it has ears but it cannot hear, it has a mouth but it cannot speak. But God, prayer is dialogue, and God speaks back. He answers Solomon's prayer in chapter 7, verses 11 to 22. And in his prayer, he gives another promise about the kinds of prayers that he will hear, and he's going to give Solomon a warning. And he says in verse 14, if my people who are called by my name humble themselves, pray, and seek my face, turn from their wicked ways. So we have a posture of humility. This topic when you read through the story of the kings of the southern kingdom in particular. Kings who humble themselves, God hears their prayers, and kings who are arrogant get into all kinds of trouble. If they will humble themselves, pray and seek my face. You're going to see this when we come to Jehoshaphat, who is faced with a military battle, and yet he seeks God's face, and he calls the entire community to prayer and to fasting. And turn from their wicked ways. Repentance is absolutely central. Turning, and then what do we have is God's promise. Then I will hear from heaven, and I will forgive their sin and heal their land. The promise here is of forgiveness. And a great example is going to be Manasseh, the worst of the southern kings. There's all kinds of things you're going to read about. And yet when God brings judgment against him, he goes to Babylon. When he's in Babylon, he prays to God, he humbles himself, and he turns from his evil ways, and God hears his prayer, and he brings him back to Jerusalem. And at that point, Manasseh says, now I know that the Lord is God, and he gets rid of his idols. See, answered prayer. This is a story about answered prayer, not just monologue, but dialogue. God also warns Solomon, verse 17. He says to him, if you walk before me as your father David walked, and you do according to all my commandments, verse 18, then I will establish your royal throne as I covenanted with your father David. You shall not lack a man on the throne. Here comes the warning. Now this is sounding conditional like the Mosaic covenant. Verse 19, but if you turn away and forsake my statutes and my commandments, and you go and serve other gods, and you worship them, verse 20, then I will uproot you from my land I've given you, and this house which I have consecrated for my name, I will cast it out of my sight. And people will say, why did all this happen? And they say, because they forsook the Lord and they went to worship other gods. Now I'd like you to turn, if you have your Bible in front of you, to 1 Kings chapter 11. 1 Kings chapter 11. What we find out is that toward the latter years of Solomon's life, he marries foreign women. What is wrong with this? He is marrying these women as political alliances. So if you marry a foreign woman and her father's the king, then you're securing your kingdom. Deuteronomy 17, God had told through Moses that the king was not to multiply wives for himself. Chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, the daughter of Pharaoh, the Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, Hittite women from the nations which the Lord had said to the sons of Israel, you shall not associate with them. But he held fast to them in love. 700 wives and princesses, 300 concubines. Verse 4. But when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods. His heart was not devoted to the Lord. Verse 5. Solomon went after Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the detestable idol of the Ammonites. Verse 6. He did evil in the sight of the Lord and did not follow the Lord fully. He built the high place for Shemosh, the detestable idol of Moab, and Molech. Verse 8. Thus he did for all his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. Now comes the judgment. Verse 9. Now the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned away from the Lord, who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him concerning this thing, said he should not go after other gods, but he did not observe what the Lord had commanded. Verse 11. So the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this, and you have not kept my covenant, my statutes, which I commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. This is the event that is going to lead to the division of the kingdom, with Jeroboam in the north and Rehoboam in the south. Verse 12, nevertheless, I will not do it in your days for the sake of your father David. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. We're going to pick up this story with Rehoboam because the kingdom is going to be torn away from him when Jeroboam and 10 tribes move up to the north. Verse 13. However, I will not tear away all the kingdom. Why? Because God made promises to David. I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem. That chapter then describes another prophecy with Ahijah the prophet, and this is then going to lead to the division of the kingdom. We're going to talk about the division of the kingdom next, and we're going to look at the reign of the northern kingdom beginning with Jeroboam. And believe me, it does not get any better.